Hi, in this lecture, we present some very fundamental security goal and design principles for cybersecurity systems, and in particular, so that we get a sense of how cryptography all fits in. So we will first define announce some of the very fundamental security goals in cybersecurity in general. Then we'll see what cryptography has to offer in terms of security goals. And then we'll review some design principles, eight to be specific, eight design principles for secure systems. So the goals of cybersecurity, they can be summarized by what we define, what we call the CIA triad, and C stands for confidentiality, I for integrity, and A for availability. So confidentiality means that your messages stay confidential. Your data, people who are not privy of your data cannot see it. Then integrity means that the data is what you think it is and it hasn't been tampered with. And availability means that your systems are available. So a traditional a sort of a use case that features the issue of availability is denial of service attacks. So when you try to connect to a service and suddenly an adversary has made it unavailable, and that could be devastating. On the other hand, cryptography, although its goals are mostly aligned with the goals of cybersecurity, they don't necessarily fully offer the whole range of goals that we have for cybersecurity. So the acronym, there's one way of phrasing the goals of cryptography that could also fit the acronym of CIA, but with slightly different meanings. So this time it would be confidentiality, integrity, and instead of availability, we're talking about authenticity. So what do they mean? Again, confidentiality means that your data is hidden from the people who don't not supposed to have access to it. Then integrity still means that the data is what you think it is. And then authenticity means that the people who send you messages are who they say they are. So the data is coming from the people that you think are supposed to produce that data. Okay, so we don't solve all the cybersecurity problems with cryptography. I think that's really the takeaway here. So now let's present eight design principles to keep in mind whenever applying cryptography to a cybersecurity problem. So first, I think to me, it's really one of the most important ones for cryptography, really in particular, is the concept of open design. So it's also known as Kirchhoff's principle, and that's so this is a statement from Kirchhoff that comes from the 19th century, and it essentially states that the security should not come from the design should be open. So the system in particular, if you have an encryption scheme, for example, the system itself, the design should be known. We should not hope to get more security by obfuscating what the system is doing. Okay, what the system is doing should be known even by your adversaries. Now, another security principle is the principle of least privilege, which essentially means that you should not give a user more privilege than what they need to complete their task. It's common sense, but bad things can happen if people don't pay attention to the kinds of privilege that each user is supposed to have. Now, another concept is the principle of fail-safe default. So what it means is that by default, the system should fall back on a very secure default behavior where unallowed access is not accepted. So it should deny access to all the users that have not been specifically allowed. So it's very important because sometimes a glitch can happen, and you want your system to always fall back on a default behavior where unauthorized access is always denied. So one way to emphasize this behavior, I've chosen this picture here of a lock but the kind of lock, the kind of door where the lock always by default, when you close the door, it always locks the door. Okay, like other doors, you have to actively close it. So if you just you have to actively lock it. So if you just close it but without actively locking it, it won't be locked. Other doors, it will lock automatically as soon as you close the door, and that's what I chose to emphasize, the principle of false safe default. So it's really like a door that locks automatically whenever you close it. Now I know it can be annoying when you forgot your key inside, but that also ensures a maximum level of security. Now, the principle of the economy of mechanism, it means that the system should be as simple as possible. So the system that is too complicated typically ends up being less secure. So if it's unnecessarily complicated, and that's systems can be complicated, unfortunately, but when they are unnecessarily complicated, then we're just basically running extra risks. Okay, it's harder to figure out what can go wrong. It's harder to figure out what your adversary can or can't do when the system is too complicated. So designers need to keep that in mind to make the system as simple as possible. Now, the principle of complete mediation means that you always check access. So what it means is you don't want to be in a situation where you've granted somebody access at some point, and then they come back a little bit later, and you think, oh, I have already allowed them access, then, but probably they should be allowed. In fact, maybe their access has been revoked in between those two attempts. So you always need to check that somebody who's trying to gain access is actually authorized at a given time. Now, the principle of separation of privilege means that for accessing a resource, it's better to use multiple conditions. So here, for example, we see a case of two locks for one safe. Okay, so if two locks are necessary for one safe, then you avoid the situation of a single point of failure. Okay, so you want access to be guaranteed by at least two independent conditions, so that if there is a point of failure, then at least security will be guaranteed by the other condition. Now, the least common mechanism means that we should not share resources. So typically, it's the case of denial of service attacks, right? So when there's only one pathway to a resource, if that pathway falls, falls down, or is being jammed, or is overcrowded, then people will lose access to their resource. Okay, so instead, it's better to have multiple pathways where every single user has its own pathway to a resource. A very important one is the principle of psychological acceptability. So what it means is, if you create a system that is so cumbersome for the users to use, then they're not going to accept it. So, and typically they're going to try to find ways around it. So an example is, if you require extra long passwords, okay, on the one hand, it does make it safer. And that's because, longer passwords are harder to break. But on the other hand, people will not be able to remember those passwords, and they're going to start noting them down on a piece of paper, perhaps taping them to the machine, or those sorts of things, which in the end, in fact, decreases the security. Even though the intention of requiring very long passwords, it makes complete sense at first glance. So that's it for this brief overview of security goals and design principles for secure systems. Thank you very much for your attention.